Late in the evening of June 11, 1937, a verdict was delivered in Moscow, one that would permanently change the history of the Red Army. Standing before a special panel of the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union was a man widely regarded as one of the most talented commanders of his generation, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky. The trial lasted only a few hours. He was accused of treason, spying for Germany, and preparing a military coup against Stalin. That same night, he was sentenced to death. Hours later, he was executed by firing squad. For decades, Soviet propaganda portrayed him as a traitor, but after Stalin's death, documents and testimony began to emerge. More and more evidence suggested that confessions had been extracted under torture, that the case against him had been fabricated, and that interrogation records bore marks later interpreted by researchers as bloodstains. Who was the man foreign observers called the Red Napoleon? Did he really plan to overthrow Stalin, or was he the victim of a dictator who had become increasingly afraid of his own commanders and allies? This is not only the story of an exceptional military leader, it is also the story of one of the most notorious political murders of the Great Purge. Mikhail Nikolaevich Tukhachevsky was born on February 16, 1893, into a family of impoverished Russian nobility in the Smolensk Governorate. Although his family had aristocratic roots, they were not wealthy. Still, its military traditions influenced the young Mikhail, who chose a career as an officer. He graduated from the Alexandrov Military School in Moscow, and shortly before the outbreak of the First World War, began serving as a second lieutenant in the Imperial Russian Army. He fought from the first months of the war. In 1915, he was captured by the Germans and sent to an officer's prisoner of war camp in Ingolstadt. Another prisoner held there was the future president of France, Charles de Gaulle. Tukhachevsky reportedly attempted to escape captivity 5 times. That determination became part of his legend long before the Bolshevik Revolution. When he returned to Russia, the country had been transformed. The Tsarist regime had collapsed, the Bolsheviks had seized power, and Russia had descended into civil war. In 1918, Tukhachevsky joined the Red Army. His military ability brought rapid promotion, and he was soon entrusted with command over increasingly large formations. During the Civil War, he won a series of victories against the anti-Bolshevik White Armies, but he also became known for his ruthlessness. In the struggle against the Bolsheviks' enemies, he did not hesitate to employ brutal methods accepted and encouraged by the Soviet leadership in the violent conditions of the Civil War. In 1920, Tukhachevsky was appointed commander of the Western Front during the Polish-Soviet War. He led the Soviet offensive toward Warsaw. For a time, victory appeared within reach, but in August, the Red Army suffered one of the greatest defeats in its history at the Battle of Warsaw. The setback was humiliating, but it did not end his career. Within the Soviet leadership, he was still considered one of the most gifted commanders produced by the young Soviet state. Even greater controversy followed in 1921 and 1922. Tukhachevsky played a major role in suppressing the Kronstadt rebellion and later commanded operations against the Tambov uprising. Surviving documents show that orders issued under his command authorized the use of chemical shells against insurgents hiding in forests. The actual scale of their use remains debated, but the existence of such orders is difficult to dispute. To some, he was a brilliant commander. To others, he was a man willing to use any method necessary to secure victory. After the Civil War, Tukhachevsky had no intention of resting on his achievements. He believed that the experience gained in the Civil War and in Poland would soon become obsolete. The world was entering an age of rapid technological change, and future wars would be decided by industrial power, mobility, and modern weapons. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Tukhachevsky became one of the strongest advocates of a fundamental modernization of the Red Army. He supported the expansion of armored forces, military aviation, airborne troops, and modern artillery, but he also emphasized that victory would not be achieved by any single branch of the armed forces. It would depend on their close coordination on the battlefield. His most important contribution to military thought was his promotion and development of what became known as deep operations. The central idea was not merely to break through the enemy's front line, it was to strike deep behind it, using tanks, aircraft, artillery, and motorized troops to destroy supply lines, command structures, reserves, and the enemy's ability to continue fighting. In simple terms, Tukhachevsky believed that a modern army should not just push the enemy back, it should shatter the entire system that kept the enemy army functioning. This was a concept far ahead of its time. Soviet theories of deep operations became some of the most advanced military ideas of the interwar period, and elements of them were incorporated into Red Army doctrine by the mid-1930s. Tukhachevsky's talent was recognized at the highest level. In 1935, he was promoted to Marshal of the Soviet Union, becoming one of the first 5 officers to receive the rank. He was only 42 years old and had reached the very top of the Soviet military hierarchy. To many observers, he represented the future of the Red Army, modern, ambitious, interested in technology, and critical of outdated military methods. But those same qualities would increasingly make Stalin suspicious of him. A talented commander with influence, independent ideas, international contacts, and prestige inside the army could look less like an asset to a paranoid dictator and more like a potential threat. After the assassination of Sergei Kirov in 1934, the atmosphere at the highest levels of Soviet power changed dramatically. Stalin increasingly saw enemies everywhere, some real, many imagined. Wave after wave of repression swept through the Communist Party, the state bureaucracy, the NKVD, and eventually the armed forces. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky was in a particularly dangerous position. He was young, popular within the army, respected by many officers, and known for his own ideas about the future of Soviet military power. In a totalitarian state, those qualities could be assets, but only up to a point. Eventually, they could become a threat. At the same time, the NKVD NKVD, now led by Nikolaevsky, was preparing a new series of political trials. These cases increasingly relied on forced confessions, torture, and fabricated evidence. To this day, historians debate the role of German intelligence in the Tukhachevsky affair. According to one version of events, SS officials under Reinhard Heydrich created forged documents suggesting that Tukhachevsky had been in contact with Germany. But even if such an operation did take place, most historians agree that Stalin had already begun moving toward a confrontation with the highest ranks of the Red Army. By early 1937, Tukhachevsky's fate was almost certainly sealed. Between 1937 and 1938, repression inside the Red Army reached an unprecedented scale. Tens of thousands of officers were dismissed, arrested, sent to labor camps, or executed. The losses were especially severe among the senior command staff. The result was devastating. Only a few years before the outbreak of the Second World War, the Red Army was stripped of many of its most experienced commanders. Fear replaced initiative, obedience became safer than competence, and officers learned that an independent opinion could be fatal. In May 1937, Mikhail Tukhachevsky was removed from his post as Deputy People's Commissar for Defense. No official explanation was given, but in Stalin's Soviet Union, sudden removal from a powerful position was often a warning sign. Soon afterward, Tukhachevsky was summoned to Moscow. On May 22, 1937, he was arrested by the NKVD. Within days, other senior Red Army commanders suffered the same fate. This made clear that the case was not directed at one man alone. It was the beginning of a much wider purge of the Soviet military. The investigation was brutal. The security apparatus used physical and psychological violence to obtain confessions that matched a prearranged version of events. The surviving interrogation records of Tukhachevsky are among the most infamous documents of the Great Purge. Brownish stains visible on some of the pages have been interpreted by researchers as traces of blood. Under these conditions, Tukhachevsky signed statements implicating both himself and other senior officers. He was accused of participating in a military conspiracy, collaborating with Germany, and preparing a coup against Stalin. Yet no reliable evidence has ever emerged showing that a real conspiracy existed. Most modern historians regard the case as a political fabrication designed to eliminate potential rivals and intimidate the entire officer corps. The trial took place on June 11, 1937, before a special session of the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union. It was closed to the public. The defendants had no meaningful opportunity to defend themselves, and the verdict had effectively been decided before the proceedings even began. The trial lasted only a few hours. The sentence was death by firing squad. That same night, the sentence was carried out. Tukhachevsky was executed together with several other leading commanders of the Red Army. It was not simply the end of one man's life, it was the beginning of one of the deepest purges in the history of any modern military. After Stalin's death, the Soviet Union entered a period of de-Stalinization. In 1957, Mikhail Tukhachevsky was posthumously rehabilitated. The Soviet state officially acknowledged that the accusations of treason and conspiracy had no foundation. One of the most debated questions is how much the military purges contributed to the disasters suffered by the Soviet Union after Germany invaded in 1941. The purges did not explain every Soviet defeat. The Red Army also faced problems of organization, training, doctrine, logistics, and strategic surprise. But the removal of so many experienced officers undoubtedly weakened its ability to respond effectively during the first months of Operation Barbarossa. Tukhachevsky's ideas, however, did not disappear with him. The concept of deep operations survived, was further developed, and eventually became central to Soviet offensive warfare in the later stages of the Second World War. From 1943 to 1945, the Red Army used large-scale coordinated offensives involving armor, artillery, infantry, air power, and mobile formations to break through enemy lines and strike deep into the rear. In that sense, some of the ideas Tukhachevsky had promoted outlived the man himself. His legacy remains deeply complicated. On one hand, he was one of the Red Army's most talented commanders and an important advocate of modern warfare. On the other, he took part in the brutal suppression of uprisings and helped build a system founded on revolutionary violence. That ambiguity is what makes him such a compelling figure. He was neither a flawless hero nor merely an innocent victim of history. He was one of the men elevated by the revolution, only to be consumed by the same system he had helped to serve. The story of Mikhail Tukhachevsky is not only the story of one marshal, it is the story of a political system that, in the name of security, began destroying some of its own most capable servants. In that system, loyalty mattered more than competence. Suspicion carried more weight than evidence. Tukhachevsky was removed not because treason had been proven, but because, in the logic of the Great Purge, the mere possibility that he might become a threat was enough to justify his destruction. His execution became one of the clearest symbols of an era in which fear replaced politics and terror became an instrument of government. And although his name was later restored to history, one question remains. How much potential did the Soviet military lose when Mikhail Tukhachevsky and thousands of other officers disappeared in the purges of 1937 and 1938?